Art is not for art's sake, but for man's sake. One contemplates art for the vision of reality it offers, writes Leonard Peikoff. Welcome to week 34 of the Objectivism Book Study. I'm Cody Leibel. We're studying the second half of chapter 12 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, reading pages 428 to 450. Why is so much of the art, of the film, the music that we see and hear today so ugly, so uninspired, so worthless? You don't need a philosophy of art in order to be struck by the fact that much of what is called art today is bad, non-art, even morally evil. But a philosophy is needed to help you see why such things strike us that way and to be able to account for it. About 7 years back, there was this video by Prager University. It was called Why is Modern Art So Bad? They compared the works of Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Vermeer to what we see today. Trash on purpose, using feces in paintings, combining the Virgin Mary with references to vile things. Why has there been such a change, such a rejection of the role of beauty, the role of standards of competence in art? The profound, the inspiring, and the beautiful were replaced by what we see today, the silly, the pointless, or the purely offensive. That's what that video explains. Now those things, the silly, the pointless, and the purely offensive, are held up as the best in modern art. We've replaced objective standards of quality, and instead we're celebrating personal expression in whatever form, especially if it is shocking or offensive. That PragerU video blamed the artists, blamed the art community, so-called, especially museum and gallery owners, and especially critics. And he called them basically the naked emperors in that story of The Emperor's New Clothes. Everybody knows that they're frauds, but they all continue acting this way. But is the problem as simple as the rejection of standards? Is the problem as simple as subjectivism? I mean, that's part of the problem. The rejection of beauty is part of the problem. But it goes deeper than that. It is a problem related to how do we understand the role of art in human life? What is the role of art? And for that, we need a philosophy. So how do we know what the standards of art should be? That's what we're going to address today. And to know that answer, you need to know what art is and what art is supposed to do for man. In light of last week's reading, we understand what art is, as understood in Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. We know that art, according to Ayn Rand, is a selective recreation of reality. So it's selective, it's a recreation of reality according to the artist's metaphysical value judgments. That's the definition of art for Rand. We know that art's main components are typically its subject, what it portrays, and its style, how it portrays it. Subject shows what the artist considers important, and thus it shows the artist's view of man's existence, according to Rand. Style, on the other hand, shows the artist's view of man's consciousness, man's way of mental functioning, be it clear, purposeful, precise, or blurred, random, vague. These choices that the artist makes are experienced by the reader or the viewer or the listener as a confirmation or a denial of his own consciousness, writes Peikoff. So now we know what art is meant to do in man's life. It offers a concrete object that summarizes a viewpoint on the world and man's relation to it. So the metaphysical questions: what kind of world is it? What does it mean to be a man? Can I live in this world? What will that life be like? These are questions that come before ethics. Not what should I do, but can I do anything? What is open to me? What are the possibilities? These are metaphysical ideas, and they are brought into the range of something perceivable. This is a hero that did this. I could do that too. This is the kind of thing that is possible in life. So art comes along beside abstract philosophy, showing what abstract philosophy can only describe. But art shows it. Art shows us what joy is like, or what suffering is like, or what a hero is like. So art exists as something worth experiencing and contemplating in itself. It refreshes the mind. It gives a man an exalted way to experience the meaning of the world in which he lives, in a form that is essentialized. That means stripped bare of all of the things that are unimportant. And it shows only that which is most stylized, most important. It brings out the part that is worth thinking about. So thus it creates a psychological experience for the viewer. Now this could be an experience of pleasure, or even sometimes of suffering. Sometimes to experience the suffering of a story gives you joy. It's a strange thing. How can that happen? So for example, sometimes you see something that is tragic, but it gives you a feeling that your own mind or your own heart has been washed or cleansed. How can that be? Aristotle referred to this as the experience of catharsis. The reason is because in that experience, whether it is in delight or in suffering, exhilaration, peace, awe, whatever it is, it has expanded the scope of your vision. And that is a joyful experience or a pleasurable experience. So through art, a man comes to a more complete understanding of what life is and what in life is important and worth thinking about. So he's able to see ideas about the world, which is often complicated and confusing, integrated into concretes that carry with them not only an intellectual but also an emotional and immediate reality. To be a work of art, and here we're speaking of fine art as against the decorative arts, the work has to be something of a specific kind. It must be selective. It must be a recreation of something in reality. Visual art, for instance, must be representational for it to be art. Music, even though music is abstract, it is representational in an extended sense. It represents an internal human experience. It recreates the sense of a thought process or an emotion process that goes on inside of a person. We ended our reading last week noting that Objectivism aims to offer a rational aesthetics. It aims to tie the faculty of reason, man's cognitive faculty, to art. And how do they try to do this? Well, we've seen this same theme come up over and over for each one of the branches of philosophy. Ayn Rand says, how in this branch of philosophy can we account for the role of man's mind? How can we account for not just reality, but reason? How can we combine those? How can we see those together in an integrated way? Well, our reading this week is going to answer that question. And so thus we're going to try to answer the question of how can you have an objective, a reasonable aesthetics? Now, Rand is going to tie her theory of aesthetics, and she's going to show how art is not just some mystical faculty that we're able to say, oh, it's beautiful, but I can't explain it. She's going to connect reason and art, specifically in her own chosen field of art, which is literature. That's her focus. So she could do it in the other fields as well, but the focus today will be in literature. One of the reasons is that it's easier to discuss because literature consists of words and concepts, so we can relate them in this format without a slideshow or without playing MP3s or something like that. Music is difficult to discuss, especially if somebody is not technically proficient in it, even painting. But with literature, we're talking about stories, which everybody can discuss. So the sections this week we're in chapter 12, Romantic Literature as illustrating the role of philosophy in art, and then aesthetic value as objective. We'll be starting on page 428. The heading is Romantic Literature as illustrating the role of philosophy in art. So let's go ahead and in the book, page 428. Peikoff writes, let's concretize the theory by focusing on a specific school of art. So within literature, there is a school of art called Romanticism. I'm going to speak in summary of the history of some of these topics, such as the classical approach to plays and poetry, and then the romantic approach to novels, and then later on the naturalistic approach to novels. So I'm assuming that you have some familiarity with the history of literature. This isn't going to be able to delve into them. To summarize, Romanticism would be something like Victor Hugo, or Dostoevsky, Friedrich Schiller, Edmond Rostand. So we're talking about Cyrano de Bergerac, that play, or we're talking about Notre Dame de Paris, or Les Mis, Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky. These are the kinds of novels or plays that are, in Rand's view, worth really thinking about as far as what do they teach us about art. And she calls them all examples of romanticism. This term romanticism has not historically been very well defined. It's a term that we would definitely put these authors in, and that's not too controversial. Rand says that romanticism in literature is the greatest achievement in art history. Major claim from Rand. She thinks especially the novel is a major artistic accomplishment. And so when she chose to enter into her career, she became a romantic novelist. The most obvious characteristic of romanticism, writes Peikoff, which many critics take as definitional, is its projection of passion, drama, color, emotion against the formulaic classicism that preceded it and the bleak naturalism that followed it. We can't go into huge detail about what that classicism and naturalism are today. I want to focus today on the romanticism, the positive, mostly. If you've ever read 20th century novels, especially early 20th century, you'll be somewhat familiar with naturalism. 1800s, that's mostly romanticism. Peikoff has a lot of expertise in the history of art and the history of philosophy. He's well qualified to speak on these topics. I would say just as well qualified as Ayn Rand. If you're interested in more of Peikoff's material on this, he has another whole book called The Dim Hypothesis, where he talks about the history of how art was treated in different periods and the philosophical connections between how art was treated and what was going on in the rest of human history. Definitely check out The Dim Hypothesis. And he also has several courses on specific literary topics, courses on operetta, courses on the great plays, like 8 great plays in the Western canon, a lecture on the value of art, even of false art. Check out Leonard Peikoff's material on this. But let's see what he says about romantic art here. He says that this emotion that we associate with romantic art, say in Les Miserables, say Jean Valjean, the character is striving to create the life that has been taken away from him. And he succeeds, and he is willing to take risks, and he's motivated. That's the hero of the story, Jean Valjean. That emotion that you see within that character, that comes from the idea that man has choice. That although something could happen to a man that would put him in jail, for instance, he's able to escape. He's able to build a new life, and he's able to make a path forward for himself. He believes that he can. So this is a key aspect in romantic literature, is the value orientation, the idea of free will. So you can see why Rand would have an affinity for those ideas, based on what we also know about Rand's philosophy and her belief in free will, her belief in value orientation. So romanticism, in Rand's definition, is a category of art based on the recognition of the principle that man possesses the faculty of volition. And here she means romanticism in literature. She and Peikoff would agree that this comes from a cultural foundation in Aristotelianism that had been present in Western Europe since the time of Aquinas, when Aristotle was reintroduced as a major important thinker in European society. We have the Renaissance coming from about the 1300s. Now, all the way 500 years later in the 1800s, Western Europe is still largely built on an Aristotelian foundation. There's this time of the Enlightenment, this time of believing in the power of science, believing in the power of man's mind. And so there arose in art, just implicitly, this sense of the life of man. A man's life can be driven by his own choices, his own values, his own understanding and thought. So he has choice, he has freedom. So he is able to select his course and act accordingly. And what kind of work of literature would be appropriate if you believed that that were true? And their answer is, if you reject determinism and if you embrace the idea of volition and you want to put that into a story, well, then you're going to need a story in which the characters choose goals, and then they seek them out, and then they're obstructed, and then they find the way through. And so we're talking about the kind of stories that have a plot structure, the kind of stories that have a hero. That's the kind of stories that would come up in a time that believes Aristotelian overall ideas about logic is important and we have free will, these kinds of things that we see defining Western European civilization. This is going to lead to this idea. Romanticism affirms volition. It affects every attribute of their work. It's going to affect the themes. What is the theme of Notre Dame de Paris, for example? Or what is the theme of Crime and Punishment? If you're familiar with those works, just let you think about that. What are the themes of those? How did those themes get chosen? It's also going to affect the kind of stories that are told. It'll affect the approach to characterization, and it'll also affect style. So we're going to see in any romantic work, you're going to see an emphasis on rejecting determinism, and that's going to play into each of those. Peikoff writes that especially the type of story and the type of characterization, those are going to be dramatically affected by an embrace of the idea of volition. In the next section here, we're on page 429. Peikoff writes, so Ayn Rand indicates the romantic approach would be as follows. If man must choose values, he has to act to gain and to keep them. And if so, then he must set his goals and engage in purposeful action. The literary form expressing the essence of such action is the plot. A plot is a purposeful progression of logically connected events leading to a resolution or a climax. Not every story has a plot. Not every form of literature, chronicles or poetry, has a plot. But a key aspect of the novel is the plot. Purposeful progression of logically connected events. So it cannot just be a recounting of a person did this and then he did that. It cannot be a collection of just little vignettes. It has to be a series of events in which the reason why event 2 happens is because event 1 happened. When we say purposeful, we mean that in two different senses. Purposeful in that the characters are seeking something, but also in that the author has created the events in such a way that it will lead in a certain direction. So there's purpose in both aspects. So Peikoff writes at the bottom of this page, a plot writer is not concerned primarily with the depiction of character, psychology, or introspection. Concerned primarily with what the characters do. That's the crucial attribute of a novel. Peikoff writes, Plot presents men in pursuit of values. It cannot just be like an action movie today where it's just pure action, escape, there's an explosion, there's a gunfight. There has to be some reason. There has to be a character that is wanting something, and you have to know something about that character. You're going to have characters where you understand their motivation. Their motivation is something that creates a character that is consistent and easy to understand. Or maybe not easy, but possible to understand. That character then needs to go seek something, and you need to see him in action. So there needs to be an integration between what the character's values are, his internal choices, and then the external, the actions that he takes. As always within Objectivism, we see this emphasis on the role of the mind, but then also there's reality and existential action. So Peikoff writes, the plot story has a definite structure. Each major event leads to the next. There's a causal connection. In Rand's words, it must be a sequence in which every major event is connected with, determined by, and proceeds from the preceding events in the story. A sequence in which nothing is irrelevant, arbitrary, or accidental, so that the logic of the events leads inevitably to a final resolution. This is something that is important within a plot. There's always a climax and a resolution. Peikoff writes, a writer cannot devise a logical sequence if his characters are goalless. So that tells you something. Part of this kind of story is that you have to have characters that have some kind of conflict that they're facing. They want something, but they have a difficulty getting it. And therefore we get to the necessity of conflict within plots. There has to be an external conflict, and it's better if there's also an internal conflict. If you only have an external conflict, then you get kind of like Saturday morning cartoons, where it's just the good guys versus the bad guys. But if you have an internal conflict, then there's something at stake more than just, can I defuse the bomb? It's also, can I overcome my fear? This person has some internal difficulty that he has to get over. I would point out, if you're interested in how stories work, there is a writer named Donald Miller who has a book called Story Brand, and he shows how brands, companies, can use the elements of plot in order to create their marketing materials. But he points out in any good story, there's going to be, like any really great story, there's going to be an external conflict and an internal one, and also perhaps a philosophical one as well, that shows like what's at stake in the universe if the good guy wins or doesn't. So I would check out Story Brand. A skillful romantic author is going to weave together a plot where there are these different layers of conflict, and where not only that, but these different characters that are involved in the story, they all have perhaps different motivations, different conflicts. And as the plot moves forward, the plot is designed in such a way that it puts the characters either in conflict with each other or with someone else in different ways. You get to see the characters either achieving or failing to achieve their goals by nature of the logic of the story. And so a single event can sometimes be the moment of finding out whether the character has achieved his goals, one or the other. An example of that would be if you think about the Ayn Rand novel, The Fountainhead, and you think about Howard Rourke as the main character, but then there's also Dominique, and there's Gail Wynand, and there's Peter Keating, there's also Ellsworth Toohey. Now, all 5 of these main characters in the story, their goals are either advanced or defeated by each of the major turning points within the story. The story shows us those characters. The story is used as a way of showing us those characters and the logic of their beliefs. All right, we're going to go to page 432. They're talking about plot structures. There needs to be a series of major events leading to a climax. And so it's not a haphazard string of occurrences. Peikoff writes, we often hear that this idea of a plot is artificial, because after all, not everybody's life is a series of these events that are major events that affect other people, and then all of a sudden someone makes a choice and it leads to a climax of some kind. Do we really see that in life? Not in everybody's life, not all the time, no. So people will say, well, this is artificial. It's like, well, yeah, of course it's artificial. We are creating this. So they'll criticize, they'll say, because the events of real life have no such structure. Now, is that really a true criticism? Is it true that the events of life have no such structure? Rand replies they actually do have it, but you have to think in terms of principles. The novel is essentialized, abstracted picture of human life. So what is it in human life that is like this? And Rand's answer is that a person's life really does have turning points. Did you make a decision about what kind of career you're going to take, about who you're going to marry, about where you're going to live, about what you're going to do in a conflict? Your life does have turning points. You meet new people, they become an important part of your life, or you leave and people are no longer a part of your life. These are the kinds of things that shape a man's life. So from that viewpoint, Rand writes, you can observe the accidents and the disasters in your life. They have maybe some importance. What matters most in determining a person's character and the kind of life that they're going to have is the sequence of choices that they make over time. And so the plot shows those sequence of choices. Peikoff writes, if the province of art is the, quote, important, then what is important to the plot writer is not the fact of accident, but the power of values in human life. Since his story presents an inexorable connection between values, action, and climax, the meaning is not only that men choose goals, but that this fact is fraught with consequence. The novel shows that there's cause and effect, and that essential cause is the choices that the man makes. We're at the top of page 433. Plot implies that life is logical, in the sense that a man's choices are what shape his fate. Contrary to the prevalent literary doctrines of today, it is realism that demands a plot structure in a novel. If one is to present man as he is metaphysically, by his nature, in reality, one has to present him in goal-directed action. Rand advocates romanticism, but she also advocates realism. That is, in her understanding of that term, realism. Other people would say realism or naturalism is probably more of the term they would use, requires that we simply select a character almost like at random. What would it be like if the neighbors next door were to live their life? What are their days like? And you just report on it. What was life like at this time in history? And you just report on it. But Rand doesn't say that that is the artistic height. In her view, you have to think about it in principle. Realism means showing people making the kinds of decisions that they really could make. People that are essentialized and abstracted. So that's the romantic aspect. So she actually refers to her literary approach as romantic realism. The kind of people that she would like to see, the kind of larger-than-life heroes, the kind of story that is told is the kind of story that really could happen. She sets her characters in mid-20th century, in a real country, in a real time. So now we're at the bottom of page 433. Peikoff writes that the top-level romanticists focus on moral values, not simply on the theme of what was life like at this time, more universal themes, kinds of value judgments that people have to make. Are we going to seek this value or that value? You put your characters in a situation where they have to make a moral decision. These novels and these plays do not merely indicate how men act, they tell us why the characters are pursuing certain goals, and the characters need to be consistent and intelligible, even when torn by conflict. This is something that I would criticize a lot of what comes out on the streaming services, TV shows in 2022. One of the major issues is unintelligible characters. The idea that a character could just suddenly switch who they are, or characters making decisions that don't seem consistent with what you're trying to say about that character. Let's go to page 434. The romanticist's characterological material, it should be the abstract. It should be what is universal within human nature. Out of the chaos of contradictions that make up most people's souls, the author selects and stylizes certain attributes, presenting them in purer form than they exist in average men. The resulting characters are larger than life. So, for example, the result of this process would not be just a modern architect that lives in New York in the 1930s, but specifically Howard Rourke. What kind of man is Howard Rourke? Well, he's not like every other architect. He's not an average. He's an exceptional man, and it's a story about an exceptional man. Howard Rourke, the individualist. All right, go to page 435 now. We're in the middle. To the romanticist, intoxicated as he is with the possible, it is a virtue, not a flaw, that the men and the events that he portrays are exceptional, dramatic, heroic, beautiful. It is a badge of honor that he does not record things as they are, but looks beyond them. He looks to the universal. Now, at the bottom of this page, Rand and Peikoff bring up Aristotle. Aristotle had made this distinction. In his writing, he mentioned this distinction between writing history versus writing poetry. Which one does he prefer? The distinction between historian and poet consists really in this, that the one describes the thing that has been, the other a kind of thing that might be. Hence, poetry is something more philosophic and of graver import than history. Aristotle says that poetry is more important. Now, Ayn Rand paraphrases, history represents things as they are, while fiction represents them as they might be and as they ought to be. This principle from Aristotle of differentiating between things as they are versus as they should be, giving a higher philosophical meaning to poetry versus history. Rand says that this is the most important principle in the aesthetics of literature. Another major claim from Rand. She thinks that this idea that the artist should show things as they might be and as they ought to be, that is the most essential principle. I think she's right. I mean, if you were to look at the different categories of things that you study in school, such as mathematics and science, history, literature, only one of them has this distinct role that literature has. Everything else is reporting on what is or has been, but literature is the realm of the might be. So that gives us a clue about what its unique power is. Top of page 436, Romanticism provides fuel for the soul. Now, some people would say that it's just escapism. Here's Rand's answer to that. She says, if the projection of value goals, the projection of an improvement on the given, the known, the immediate available is an escape, then medicine is an escape from disease. Agriculture is an escape from hunger. Knowledge is an escape from ignorance. Ambition, an escape from sloth. And life is an escape from death. If so, then a hardcore realist is a vermin-eaten brute who sits motionless in a mud puddle, contemplates a pigsty, and whines that such is life. If that is realism, then I am an escapist. So was Aristotle, so was Christopher Columbus. If it be treason, make the most of it, is her rhetorical approach there. Art does something, in the way that medicine does something. It is not merely a retreat from reality, it is a way of experiencing reality. A different way, sort of like studying a philosophy book, is a different way of experiencing reality versus going about my normal day. There's a place for studying philosophy, there's a place for studying art in life. Top of page 437, Rand calls her approach to art romantic realism. So the world that she creates might actually be, so that's the realist thing, but she's a romantic in the sense that she presents men as they ought to be. So there's some sense of larger-than-life abstractness to her characters. Definitely you can see that in Atlas Shrugged, especially with the character John Galt. Is almost created to be a godlike figure in that story. Larger than life for sure. And in that sense, he is also not a three-dimensional character. And that wasn't necessary for all of her characters. She has some characters that are much more well-rounded. In other words, that you can see more aspects to how they think, and characters that have flaws tend to be more realistic. For example, Henry Reardon or Dagny Taggart have more flaws. They look more like real people. If you look at John Galt, he doesn't exactly look like a real person. When I'm reading that story, I always think this reminds me of a comic book, but not in a bad way. A comic book is an abstract, summarized picture of a person. So she says she's realistic in the sense that she places their characters here and now on this earth. Now, this next section, we're going to talk a little bit about style, and I want to get into Ayn Rand's literary style, because in the last session, we looked a little bit at Mickey Spillane, we looked at Thomas Wolfe. I want to read some sections from Rand. This is what Peikoff says. In regard to style, the romantic writer is highly selective. Romantic style, in Rand's words, is a description by means of essentials, but giving one the concretes, not the floating abstractions. So I haven't seen this, but I just watched a review on YouTube of it, the She-Hulk show. Now, you want your character to have some kind of personality. Now, how are you going to show that the character has this personality? Are you going to put her in a situation and show how she responds? Or are you just going to have her talk about herself? Or are you going to have another character come in the room and talk about her and say how brave she is or how good she is? This also happened in the Obi-Wan series, where you've got characters telling us how brave Princess Leia as a 10-year-old is without actually compellingly showing it. How are you going to make your character real? It goes back to the classic fourth grade writing advice. You have to show, not tell. A story that we looked at last week with Thomas Wolfe, I read an excerpt where he describes New York City, and he only tells you how he feels about it without telling you what he's seen. We're going to compare that to how Ayn Rand will show. So I pulled up several excerpts. These are from Atlas Shrugged, just some examples of style. This is one of the most memorable scenes in Atlas Shrugged to me. It's a description of a minor character named Mayor Bascom. Mayor Bascom of Rome, Wisconsin, leaned back in his chair. His chest and stomach formed a pear-shaped outline under his soiled shirt. The air was a mixture of sun and dust, pressing heavily upon the porch of his house. He waved his arm, the ring on his finger flashing a large topaz of poor quality. Now, from that short description, you already know exactly what kind of man he is. You've met a man like this, or you've seen this kind of person before, perhaps in a movie or something. You get the idea of what kind of man this is, and everything that follows is going to be that same picture. But notice, she didn't say, this is a cheap, materialistic, lazy. She didn't say any of that. But you know it just by looking at the description of his soiled shirt. The air was a mixture of sun and dust. So you can see that there's a sense of stagnation. She creates the evaluations, but she builds them into the descriptions of what the characters actually see. So Dagny and Henry Reardon saw all these things. And so when you read this, you know that the characters saw this and they came to this conclusion about this man. A couple of other examples. Henry Reardon and Dagny Taggart are driving, and they're on a vacation looking for old factories to see if there's any old supplies that they could use because they're running out of factory parts. They're driving down the highway kind of outside of civilization. Reardon smiled. There's something to be said for the wilderness. I'm beginning to like it. New country that nobody's discovered. She nodded gaily. Good soil. And then she says, look at the way things grow. I'd clear that brush and I'd build a... And then they stopped smiling. The corpse they saw in the weeds by the roadside was a rusty cylinder with bits of glass, the remnant of a gas station pump. It was the only thing left visible. The few charred posts, the slab of concrete, and the sparkle of glass dust, which had been a gas station, were swallowed in the brush, not to be noticed except by a careful glance, and not to be seen at all in another year. They looked away. They drove on, not wanting to know what else lay hidden under the miles of weeds. They felt the same wonder, like a weight in the silence between them, wonder as to how much the weeds had swallowed and how fast. What could have been a very simple, unemotional description became a very emotional one. Rand could have said they were driving and they said, "We love the way this place looks to be so green and it's beautiful out here." And then they saw a gas station, and Dagny could have commented and said, "Oh look, can you believe it? There's a gas station under all those weeds." That's not what Rand did. Rand showed the value judgments, and she did it by her choice of words. So for example, the corpse they saw, they actually did see the corpse of a gas station, but she chose the word corpse on purpose. And she describes the rusty cylinder, the bits of glass, this garbage, overgrown. You can immediately in your mind picture exactly what they saw, because you've probably seen it sometime. You've seen a place that used to be an outpost of human civilization that has been abandoned. The sense of what is abandoned and creating an emotion on the people. She doesn't tell us what we should feel, but she provides us the experience that Dagny and that Henry had, an experience of horror. I'll give you one last, and this is in Atlas Shrugged. Later on in the story, Dagny is on a train. Ask yourself, what kind of sense of emotion is Rand trying to convey in this scene? And does she use the words that actually name the emotions, or does she just provide the visuals and leave you to do the work to arrive at the emotions? So this is Dagny. She sat at the window of the train, her head thrown back, not moving, wishing she would never have to move again. The telegraph poles went racing past the window, but the train seemed lost in a void, between a brown stretch of prairie and a solid spread of rusty grain clouds. Twilight was draining the sky without the wound of a sunset. It looked more like the fading of an anemic body in the process of exhausting its last drops of blood and light. The train was going west as if it too were pulled to follow the sinking rays and quietly to vanish from the earth. She sat still, feeling no desire to resist it. She wished she would not hear the sound of the wheels. They knocked in an even rhythm, every fourth knock accented, and it seemed to her that through the rapid running clatter of some futile stampede to escape, the beat of the accented knocks was like the steps of an enemy moving toward some inexorable purpose. She had never experienced it before, this sense of apprehension at the sight of the prairie, this feeling that the rail was only a fragile thread stretched across an enormous emptiness, like a worn nerve ready to break. She had never expected that she, who had felt as if she were the motive power aboard a train, would now sit wishing like a child or a savage that this train would move, that it would not stop, that it would get her there on time, wishing it. Not like an act of a will, but like a plea to a dark unknown. This section shows you the inner state of Dagny's mind, and it shows it by showing what she is seeing and what she's thinking about as she's seeing it. In the Opar book, on page 437, the idea here is you give descriptions by means of essentials. You give them the concretes, not floating abstractions. You give them perceptual essentials, down to small touches that make the object concretely real to the reader. So the writing is not neutral, the writing is not detached, but it is emotionally slanted. Rand could have written this train scene in a way that created an entirely different emotion, by choosing different things to highlight visually or auditorily, different thoughts that would have come to Dagny as she was in this train. But Rand chose to emotionally slant the description. And what it conveys is not merely facts, but facts bearing an evaluative meaning of some kind. The evaluation is not superimposed on the description. It seems to flow inevitably from it. Like the cheap topaz ring, there's an evaluation that flows from that observation. Mickey Spillane is another example of a writer that does this well. In Rand's other work on the art of fiction, in her book The Romantic Manifesto, you get more material like this. Page 437, we are wrapping up this material on the romantic realism approach to literature, and we're just about to get into the next section where Rand describes aesthetic value as being objective. They set out to explain how do you connect the mind to art. And what we've just done here, by telling a certain kind of story, characters in pursuit of something, seeing things that immediately bring to our mind observable concretes, but also in an essentialized way that leads to a certain evaluation, that's an act of integration. That's especially the province of romantic literature. And so Rand is answering the question here. How does romantic literature respect the mind? And now we've seen an illustration of it. We've seen an illustration of how the mind is able by attending to the details to come to a certain conclusion, to a certain experience. And that's not something that you find in all examples of art throughout human history, not to that degree. And I think that's why she prefers romantic literary style. There's an integration there. Let's go to the next page. On page 438, we're going to look at aesthetic value as objective. So Peikoff writes there is a difference between philosophic and aesthetic judgment. So Rand judges romantic realism or romanticism, like in the greats of the 19th century, aesthetically great. That doesn't mean that they were all philosophically great. So, for example, she disagrees with the philosophy of Dostoevsky. She disagrees with the political philosophy of Victor Hugo. But she believes that their works of art are good as art, even if they sometimes communicate a false worldview. This is Rand. The fact that one agrees or disagrees with an artist's philosophy is irrelevant to the aesthetic appraisal of a work of art qua art. A false philosophy can be embodied in a great work of art, a true philosophy in an inferior or worthless one. Think about the Christian film industry. How do you judge aesthetic value? This is a difficult question, and I think that Rand doesn't go into great detail on the topic of beauty, but I think beauty is an important factor here. If you're going to judge a classical piano composition, you're going to ask, is it beautiful? If you're going to judge a painting, you should judge, is it beautiful? That's not the only aspect. There could be a quite ugly painting that is still great as art. But I think beauty is an important aspect. Probably do well to be familiar with the history of Western civilization's approach to this topic of beauty. And I'll have some things to say about that in addition to what Rand is saying here. Not that I think that Rand's work on this is incomplete. Rather, I think that she never designed her presentations on aesthetics to cover the whole thing. She didn't write a treatise on aesthetics. She had specific things she wanted to say. One of the things that we're going to see in Rand's work in any topic is this dichotomy between what she calls the intrinsic and the subjective. We've seen this in politics. We've seen this in her epistemology and her ethics. In art, there is also this pattern. There are often people that are the subjectivists, and then there are people that are the intrinsicists in aesthetics. Peikoff writes, with rare exceptions, aestheticians who reject emotionalism, subjectivism, turned instead to authoritarianism. And the example of the authoritarians in aesthetics would be the classicalists. There would be those who advocated classicalism in poetry, in theater, in architecture. By the way, this is not a rejection of classical music or of Bach or Mozart or anything like that. What they're talking about in this context is the classicalists in literature that laid out rules that said that in order for a play to be beautiful, it has to look like these other great plays of the past. It has to have this structure. It has to have this amount of scenes, these kinds of characters. This character in the play has to have this proportion of the lines, and this one has to have less. And so they kind of mapped it out on the basis of plays that they already thought were good. They said in order to be good, it just has to mathematically line up like this. That's classicalism. I've seen that also. Some of our presuppositionalist Christian friends, they have written books on architecture in which they basically say that beauty in architecture requires that you have columns, like Greek columns, because the proportion of Greek columns, that is the definition of beauty in architecture. They came at it in a very authoritarian way. And you can see why the subjectivists have taken over in architecture or in aesthetics in general, when you realize that the only people that have ever defended objective standards have, for the most part, done it so amateurly as to do something like to say, well, Greek columns are beauty, and that's what beauty is. Rand addresses these, and she says, in essence, an objective evaluation requires that one identify the artist's theme, the abstract meaning of his work, exclusively by identifying the evidence contained in the work and allowing no other outside considerations, then evaluate the means by which he conveys it. Taking his theme as criterion, evaluate the purely aesthetic elements of the work, the technical mastery or lack of it, with which he projects or fails to project his view of life. Rand would look at a Beethoven symphony, say Beethoven's Fifth, dun 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 dun. She would say that that is a great work of art, but she didn't appreciate the sense of life of that work of art. But nevertheless, it was aesthetically excellent. And I agree with her. I perhaps relate more to the sense of life of Beethoven than Rand would have. The point is that you cannot just approach the aesthetic judgment task by saying, does it meet some other paradigm? There has to be a role in human life for new art to be created and for new paradigms to be created. You don't measure one work of art by whether it looks like a different one. You measure it on its own standards by asking, what is the purpose of the artist here? What is his theme? What means does he use to realize that theme? And this is hard work. So part of aesthetic judgment is asking, is the artist skillful? And that's something that every art school in public colleges today needs to be reminded of. There are basic requirements of skill, the ability to depict something as it actually looks rather than blobs of color. It's hard work. And so Peikoff writes, You must methodically exploit the attributes of the medium to the end of conveying one's meaning in every shading of nuance. And if you think about the difficulty of that, the difficulty even of just drawing something accurately or painting it in such a way that it looks three-dimensional, the difficulty of creating a film with edits that show the meaning and that also competently capture the subject in focus with the color that you decide, with the composition that you decide, it is hard work. We have to approach the task of artistic judgment by asking ourselves, what are the standards of each individual type of art? And that takes a lot of study. We can't go into it in great detail here. But they will give, in the next several pages, they'll give us some of the ways that Rand could approach the standards of judgment. And I'll share with you Rand's, and as we go on, I'll mention some connections to Aquinas. Rand isn't the first person to put out these terms. Rand and Peikoff together, they point out, here are 3 aesthetic principles that you might want to consider as you're looking at art. The first is selectivity in regard to subject. What subject did the person choose to convey? For instance, you have a famous Rembrandt painting that looks like a slab of meat, and it's exquisitely detailed, but the subject is not worthy of contemplation. And so it becomes like an exercise in just excellence in technique for its own sake. And that's artistically not as good as, say, a historically dramatic painting. So Peikoff writes, since the subject is what conveys the artist's metaphysics, art by its nature must have a subject. It must be at least implicitly philosophical. So Rand writes, in literature, the subject, that would be the story. That means plot, characters, the kind of men and events that the writer chooses to portray. So you're not allowed to just choose something at random or imitate something else. Otherwise you get bad art. Rand writes, the primary cause of bad art is the fact that it is a product of imitation, not of creative expression. The imitator is not guided by a sense of life. He picks up the elements from other works instead, throwing in a love triangle to spice up a lagging storyline, a windy dissertation on death and infinity for depth, or a splashy production number to ensure a big finale. You're just imitating what you've seen before. It is devoid of meaning and therefore of aesthetic value. Imagine if the purpose of your work of art was only to portray style, but not to portray a certain subject. So like the Rembrandt painting of the piece of meat. She says this is a fundamental inversion. The subject is not the only attribute of art, but it is the fundamental one. It is the end to which all others are means. So most aesthetic theories don't really account for the subject. That's a weakness in them. So the subject is not aesthetically irrelevant. It's relevant. One of Rand's favorite painters was Johannes Vermeer, the girl with a pearl earring, or you've seen milkmaid pouring out of a jar in the 1600s in the Netherlands. She's wearing blue and yellow, and she's pouring out from a jar this bright white milk. You've seen this painter, and if you've seen him, you understand why she appreciates him so much. But she also says, why did he confine himself to these small and sort of trivial subjects? So she has some criticism of his choice of subject. 443. Rand says that which is not worth contemplating in life is not worth recreating in art. It's an important principle of hers. So she doesn't think that you should just contemplate misery and disaster for its own sake, or the trivial or the mundane for its own sake. Peikoff takes us to the second principle of aesthetic judgment. He says clarity. Clarity denotes the quality of being distinct, sharp, evident to the mind, as against being obscure, clouded, or confused. Now here, Rand and Peikoff are aligning very much with the Western tradition. If you think about the art of savages versus the art of the Greeks, think about their sculpture. Something that stands out when you look at Greek sculpture is how accurate. You know what you're seeing. It's true to life. It's very clear. In the music that came out of Western civilization, you see the rejection of dissonance in favor of consonance, a huge fixation within Western music on what kind of intervals harmonically can exist consonantly together at mathematical intervals that our ears can integrate. And so you have a focus on the major scale. The major scale, it allows for a great degree of consonant intervals. You see this in the Western approach to painting, that there was a pursuit more and more of portraying things in a way that is realistic to how we see things. Now, you get to the 20th century, you see Picasso, Cubism, it's postmodern approaches where you're seeing things distorted. That's not what I'm talking about. Think about the difference between, say, Picasso and the people 100 years before. It almost is photographically real, portrayed in a way that your mind can easily understand what you're seeing. And the more you look, the more it rewards study. You see representational details. That's clarity. That's the opposite of what people today want in art. They want ambiguity. They want to make it so that you don't know what the author thinks. You don't know what the film director thinks. You don't know what his theme is. You don't know whether that was a happy ending or a sad ending because he left you on a cliffhanger. It's ambiguity for ambiguity's sake. So that seems to be what is in vogue today. Rand would appreciate an approach to art where full mental focus and understanding and comprehension is an important value. Predominantly, though not exclusively, writes Rand, a man whose normal mental state is a state of full focus will create and respond to a style of radiant clarity and ruthless precision, a style that projects sharp outlines, cleanliness, purpose, an intransigent commitment to full awareness and a clear-cut identity. A level of awareness appropriate to a universe where A is A, where everything is open to man's consciousness and demands its constant functioning. So it's not to say that you can't have mystery in your story. There should be a purpose for it. When the author puts mystery in, they should have a payoff. What we're getting here is a rejection of the J.J. Abrams approach to storytelling. 445, we're answering non-objective art. Non-objective art deliberately flouts the rules of the human mind, perceptual and conceptual. It is addressed to a man as he does not perceive and cannot think. Such a product is not open to human cognition. It is defiantly senseless. Non-objective art would be exemplified by taking a photograph of a urinal and putting that in a museum. You're basically challenging people, find some way to make this make sense. You can't. Haha, I win. It's nihilism as an approach to art. Rand would not say that that's bad art. She'd say that's non-art or anti-art. Not even just non-art, but anti. In other words, it's a piece of trash devised to negate our ability to think about what art actually is. It's designed to confuse and to destroy. Metaphysically, it is an attempt not to recreate, but to annihilate reality. Epistemologically, it is the attempt not to integrate, but to disintegrate man's consciousness. In Rand's word, to reduce it to a pre-perceptual level by breaking up percepts into mere sensations. This, she writes, is the intention behind the reducing of language to grunts, literature to moods, painting to smears, and sculpture to slabs, music to noise. As Christians, or traditionalists, we can agree with Rand on these issues. These innovations, so-called today, are anti-art. Peikoff writes, objective art is not necessarily good, but it is graspable by a rational being. To this extent, it at least qualifies as a legitimate human product. The idea of clarity is essential to Rand's theory. It's also essential to what we see in Christianity. I'll just take a pause from Rand's work to share about what I think is a good approach to understanding beauty that we see within the work of Aquinas. Just some basic passages in Scripture that help us understand that beauty is something that Christians should care about. So Genesis chapter 1. Verse 31, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Good in all ways, so including beautiful. And there was evening and morning, it was the sixth day. When God sets out on showing the Jewish nation how to worship him, they are to do it in a way that is excellent. Exodus chapter 35, let every skillful craftsman among you come and make all that the Lord has commanded, the tabernacle, its tent, its coverings. He doesn't choose the most amateurish, he chooses the most skillful of the craftsmen. In our worship of God, we are to recognize his goodness, his excellence, his beauty. So Psalm 27:4, one thing I have asked the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. So within Christianity, within Judaism, there is an emphasis on beauty that is considered common sense. And to say that God is good would require that God is beautiful. It would be impossible to say he's good and he's ugly. Not something that we do. Ecclesiastes 3:11, he has made everything beautiful in its time. There's a beauty in the world that God has made. 1 Chronicles 16:29, ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name, and bring an offering and come before him. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. Bringing up these passages in connection with Peikoff's points about clarity. Clarity means the human mind has the ability to understand it. The Bible often speaks about God's splendor or glory. Splendor and clarity, these are related topics. I'm going to read a little bit about a theory of beauty that I endorse. It's called the processing fluency theory of beauty. Now, this is not a full approach to aesthetics. It's from an article by R. Reber called Processing Fluency, Aesthetic Pleasure, and Culturally Shared Taste. He writes, if people process information about an object easily, they feel positive affect, especially if ease of processing is unexpected. That's important. So this mild positive effect is experienced as beauty. Let me state at the outset that although the fluency theory covers some interesting phenomena, it does not cover all kinds of aesthetic pleasure, like emotions that go beyond mild positive affect, or formal or stylistic judgments that promote aesthetic understanding. Moreover, the fluency theory of beauty does not say anything about artistic value. There are beautiful paintings without artistic merit. There's good art, not necessarily beautiful. Hieronymus Bosch from the Middle Ages, not beautiful, but artistically high merit. Thomas Kincaid, beautiful, not necessarily high artistic merit. You can have different artistic merit. That's not the same thing as beauty. On the issue of what beauty is this ability to process the information easily and integrate it into your mind in a way that is easy, but especially unexpected. For example, you hear a song and there's a little bit of a melody and then a little more, and then you hear the third part, and all of a sudden you think, that sounds right. That sounds like what I was expecting. Interesting. It's this sense of your mind being taken on a journey. And when you get there, you didn't know that that's where you were going, but once you get there, it feels right. Similar to the experience of if you go to a magic show. The climax of the magic trick, you see what they did and you're like, I didn't know where you were taking me on this narrative, but now I see that we had to get here. It's the same thing on a plot. When you get there, oh yes, that does seem like where we had to go. That is the sense of clarity. It's the sense that your mind was able to see. Your ability to see has been expanded. Let's talk about Aquinas. His thought on beauty, and this is consistent with the mainstream. It goes back to Aristotle and Plato. It goes to Plotinus and Augustine. But Aquinas is one that has articulated it fairly briefly, but fairly well. His theory influenced what came after. These philosophers throughout history, they've always been asking this question, can we quantify beauty? One thing that you can quantify is symmetry. So they said, mathematically, could you prove that something is beautiful by its symmetry or by the balance of the colors? In the medieval times, what they were looking at was the beauty in architecture or painting as well. They began to explore beauty in painting, tapestry, those kinds of things, and also beauty in music. Now, if you think about what is architecture and what is music, there's a huge relationship there because they're abstract shapes that can repeat. So say you have windows, so you have groupings of windows. It's very similar to the way music looks on a sheet where it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The medievals were looking at that and they were trying to figure out, do we need to have a certain kind of a pattern here where it's like A, B as far as some structure. And that creates a sense of beauty. And they thought about it and they realized, no, that cannot be, because how do you know whether A is beautiful? You cannot reduce an entire theory of beauty to symmetry, because what if you had ugly, ugly, very ugly, 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 very ugly? Well, the thing that you're using as your component has to also be beautiful. How do we account for the beauty of that? And so they realized that that was a problem. So they said there has to be other dimensions besides just symmetry. This is from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's on the article Medieval Theories of Esthetics. I just found some excerpts that I think are pretty useful to get you up to speed on this topic. While medieval philosophers did not develop a system of aesthetics, they do provide an interesting entry point to the study of aesthetics. So Aristotle emphasized some characteristics that art requires in order to be good. So beauty is a matter of size and order, says Aristotle. Size is important because something too small or too large is beyond one's capacity to perceive the whole. So it needs to be able to be perceived. Proportion was very important to the medieval artisans, especially for architecture and music. In architecture, the primacy of proportion is most clearly seen in the cathedrals. Some cathedrals, from an aerial viewpoint, were in the shape of a cross. This shape also created a balance when viewed from within the cathedral. Paintings had to exhibit balance in their compositions, and it was important for music to exhibit harmony in order for it to be beautiful. Harmony, in this case, referring to the intervals, tritones versus perfect fifths and fourths. The effects of light became more important to the medieval artisans, particularly in architecture, and they frequently associated light with their theories of color. Light and color affected the thoughts of medieval thinkers on certain characteristics of beauty, such as radiance and clarity. When you see a painting or stained glass, do you have the sense that you understand what it is, and does it have the sense of radiance? Radiance would be the quality of catching your attention, making your mind want to look at it. So medieval symbolism is also another important aspect. They focused on that, on balance or harmony, on the clarity, and on symbolism. Very often they made reference to allegory. That was something especially from Platonism. They loved allegory. Now, here's a quote from St. Augustine. In a sense, God's beauty emanates out to natural things through his act of creation. The framework for this idea has its source in Neoplatonic philosophers. God created matter, which was initially formless without any beauty. Within Platonic philosophy, they see God as being beautiful and being fully real, and then they see there being layers, like the angels are less real, less beautiful. The earth and man are even less beautiful, less real. That's not Rand's system. That's not what I would affirm either. I don't think that realness is on a spectrum the way that Plato and later Augustine would have said. But now we get to Thomas Aquinas in the history of medieval thought. Aquinas' definition of beauty is that which gives pleasure when seen, and by seen he means actively contemplated, so that which rewards contemplation and study. Within Aquinas and others around this time, talking about like the 1200s AD, we get to this emphasis on the role of the mind. So this is within Christian thought. The role of the mind's been important in aesthetic theory. Jacques Maritain offers some helpful explanation. Beauty is essentially the object of intelligence, for what knows in the full meaning of the word is the mind. Beauty is the object of intelligence. When we say that something is beautiful, we're saying that it's something that can be perceived by an intelligent mind. Thomas Aquinas maintains the objectivity of beauty in the sense that beauty resides in the object. In other words, beauty is not a concept in the mind of the beholder imposed onto a given object. Beauty is objective. If beauty is objective, there must be some criteria by which we discover whether something is in fact beautiful. And so for Thomas, he offers 4 primary standards. These are Thomas's criteria for beauty. It must possess actuality, proportion, radiance, and integrity. Now, actuality is an easy one. Anything that exists has a degree of beauty. He's making a fairly rudimentary point here. There is beauty in everything, some degree of beauty. It's just a question of how much. To be is to have some beauty. Different things have beauty in regard to their form. So the tree has a certain kind of beauty. The dog has a certain kind of beauty. The next one is proportion. It has to do with harmony of the different components. Not too much of one thing, not too much of another, but things in balance. An easy example to understand proportion would be the way that houses are typically painted. There will be one primary and one secondary color, and then perhaps a splash color that's a tertiary. That proportion creates almost like a Fibonacci effect on your mind. Another of his standards, the third one, is radiance. And radiance means brightness, the ability to capture your mind, the ability to pull your mind in so that you perceive it, so that you can study it, and so that you can process it. And then finally, integrity. That means that there needs to be no contradictions. There needs to be a wholeness. There's nothing lacking in it. Some thoughts from Aquinas, the need of the ability of the mind to process. That is a key aspect of beauty as Western civilization has always seen the topic. There's a lot to be said for this processing fluency concept. And part of the reason why I think it's important is because processing fluency depends in part on the object that's being perceived and in part on the subject, the person that's perceiving. There is a place for learning how to perceive beauty over time and being enculturated to a certain concept of what is beautiful. And the processing fluency theory explains why that would be. Because the more practice you have with a certain art form, the more you're able to know. And you know this is true if you've listened to a certain genre of music and gotten more into a genre of music. You realize that there's good and bad within that genre, and you begin to be more discriminating within that genre than somebody who just has only listened to it once or twice. Over time, because you live in a certain culture, because you're exposed to certain things, you begin to have a greater capacity to respond to beauty in a certain kind of art. And we need to account for that. And that goes against those who want to be arbitrary, like the classicalists that would want to say, no, it's just, this is it. It follows the rules. It's beautiful. And if you don't agree, you're just wrong. That's not the way to approach it. Now, let's go to, in the bottom of page 445, the third principle of aesthetic judgment from Rand and Peikoff is integration. Now, we just saw that. That's why I brought that in from Aquinas. Integration. Or wholeness. That's essential to appreciating art. Peikoff writes, since art is selective, the artist must be so too in every aspect of its function. The work has to be an indivisible whole. Rand celebrates Siegfried, which is a film by the German director Fritz Lang. He says nothing in this film is accidental. Everything is stylized. They consider that to be the motto of great art. Peikoff writes, since everything included in an artwork acquires significance by virtue of being included, the inclusion of anything insignificant produces a lethal contradiction. By the nature of the art, the item must mean something, and yet it doesn't. One of the ways that I've heard people praise a movie is if they get to the end of a movie and they say, wow, that movie didn't have any fat on it. Well, what they're saying when they say it didn't have any fat on it is everything in that movie was necessary to create an integrated whole. There was not a moment in there where there was just something useless. Everything in there was good and part of that movie, creating that moment at the end of the movie when the movie ends and you realize, that's what the story was. It was integrated whole. An organic unity. Aristotle would call it the organic unity of a living creature. All of the parts seemed to imply the whole. Top of 447, a good novel, writes Rand, illustrating the point in her field, is an indivisible sum. Every scene, sequence, and passage of a good novel has to involve, contribute to, and advance all of its major attributes, theme, plot, characterization. If a good novelist sends his characters to the country for a weekend, he does not interrupt the action in order to offer a needless description, however loving of the countryside. If he offers it, he needs it, and an intelligent reader can know why. Peikoff offers this excerpt from the Fountainhead where they are in the trial. Clerk says, the prisoner will now rise and face the jury. And Howard Work steps forward, but then in the back, Gail Winan steps forward. They use this as an example of integration, because if you know the story, Winan also feels like he's on trial. And so it's just a simple moment. Winan also stood. But that's the kind of thing that would happen, and it's the kind of thing that shows his development, and it shows what's at stake for him. It's all in the same moment. The fate of the character of Rourke and of Wynand is all being determined in this moment. And so that's the integration effect of a good story, of a good plot structure. Peikoff writes of that, this is a non-accidental detail. Doesn't report on the fact that so-and-so on the other side of the courtroom sneezed. It reports on the essential detail that Wynand stood. Bit of a plug in this for an essay by Ayn Rand called Art and Cognition. I reviewed the essay yesterday and it is fantastic. Rand discusses how we perceive beauty or artistic meaning within literature, music, within painting, dance, film, theater. She goes and she explains the role of the mind in each of those, similar to what we've done here in literature. You can find that in her book, The Romantic Manifesto. It's definitely worth understanding. And it will even give you a broader understanding of her overall philosophy, of what she means when she says that goodness is an aspect of reality in relation to man. I came to a greater understanding of that when I understood that beauty in music is an aspect of reality of the notes in relation to man, in relation to my mind. By the study of music, I began to understand Rand's philosophy more. Art can be judged rationally. This chapter is concluding. Aesthetic appraisal does not involve an aesthetic sense, as if there's like some mystical sixth sense that you would have. Somehow divines the qualities inherent in the artwork apart from any relation to human consciousness. No, you can understand why something is beautiful because of what the human consciousness is and because of what the object is. So we reject the arbitrary dogmatism of classicism. We also reject subjectivism and postmodernism. We embrace an approach to art that says art must be a certain kind of thing that has some certain kind of effect on the mind. This is the key of the entire chapter. As in ethics, so also in aesthetics. Value is an aspect of reality in relation to man. Value means the evaluation of a fact in accordance with rational principles, principles reducible to sense perception. This is precisely the pattern that follows in aesthetic evaluation. One reduces aesthetic principles to the nature of art, and art to the need of human life, to the primary of ethics, which in turn reduces to one's acceptance of the axiom of existence. He writes, like goodness, therefore, beauty is not in the object or in the eye of the beholder. It is objective, meaning it is in the object as judged by a rational beholder, if you're familiar with the objectivist approach to ethics, to value, to morality. Goodness is an aspect of reality in relation to the beholder. Likewise, beauty is an aspect of reality in relation to, as perceived by, the beholder. Rand writes, it is not a contradiction to say, this is a great work of art, but I don't like it, provided one defines the exact meaning of the statement. The first part refers to the aesthetic appraisal, the second to the deeper philosophical level. By those standards that Rand has laid out, you can evaluate an artwork aesthetically and philosophically. She concludes that Romanticism is objectively the greatest kind of art in history. Romanticism is what Ayn Rand provides in her own writing. In Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead, We the Living, and Anthem, her four main works of fiction, as well as some of her plays. She provides a feast, Peikoff says. In her philosophic and aesthetic essays, Rand defined the nature and the deepest roots of great art. She was explaining such art while creating it. She was making possible a rebirth of Romanticism while starting the rebirth herself. Peikoff ends his chapter, Ayn Rand identified all the way down to fundamentals why man needs the unique form of nourishment which is art. Then to a starving century, she provided a banquet. So that is as far as we go in the reading today. I'll offer some summarizing remarks. I would agree with Rand on her major insights on aesthetic theory about what the role of art is in life and about what makes for good standards for art. And I think these are consistent with a Christian approach to philosophy and to theology. I agree with her on the importance of beauty in life. And when I consider the heritage of Christianity, I think that Christian teachings and Christian history and the products of Christian history are uniquely strong in the areas of beauty and in art, especially if you compare them to non-Christian products. With Ayn Rand, I'm going to say that art should represent and give people an experience, and I would reject the idea of art as propaganda. Art should not be a propaganda for values, but rather a means of letting people experience them. I also reject with Rand the arbitrary intrinsic approach to art. The mind has a role. Conditioning has a role in how we experience beauty, and therefore it is necessary that we be educated to appreciate art. It takes work, and that work will pay off. It's worth your time. As you seek to decide whether something meets artistic standards, you must account for both the thing that is being evaluated and also the individual mind, the qualities of the object and of the viewer. It is an important part of human life that we learn to appreciate art, that we inculcate a love for beauty in our children and even in ourselves. We must grow our capacity to understand and to see. We must develop that. It is true that there is a unique human need for art, even more basically, a unique human need for beauty. So as we seek to live in a way that is more full, that is more human, each of us is going to benefit greatly from understanding and experiencing different forms of art. Sculpture, painting, music, theater, literature, architecture, and so on. Today, these are all part of our historical heritage as members of Western civilization. From whatever background you come from, you are in Western civilization now. And so Western civilization is your heritage, and it's a good heritage, and we can defend it. An appreciation of beauty and of art and what is good in art is going to be a necessary part of our future if there is to be a human future. Take the time. Don't be the kind of person who concerns himself only with abstractions or only with theological precision, but ignores the experience of beauty that you find within the Bible, the experience of the poetry in the Bible, or the experience of beauty that you find in other works of art, or even in film or music. And if you're a pastor, make sure that your sermons are beautiful, because if your sermons are not beautiful and engaging, then you're lying about God. We have one more session next week, the epilogue, in which Peikoff explains his view of history and the role of ideas in history, especially the battle between Aristotle and Plato. I look forward to that discussion, and I'll talk to you then. God bless.